viewing a camera that she thought was concerning. It was called to let me know about it.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 10. I apologize, Exhibit 12.
Thursday, 1/4, May 25, 2020.
Hey, this is Channel. Hey, what's up? Hey, so, just wanted to let you know about the person with a knife at 2602 Bloomington. And then, I didn't know, you can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for 320's call. Oh, did they already put him in the, they must have already started moving him. And 320 over at Cup Food.
Okay.
I don't know if they have used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed to or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
We haven't said anything unless they're just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
Okay,
I'll find out.
no problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks a little different. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
2031, 33, May 25, 2020.
Sir, did you recognize your own voice in that telephone call?
Yes, that was me.
You made a reference to possibly it not counting. Can you please explain to the jury what that means?
I thought maybe she was just describing that they'd taken somebody to the ground, placed them on the ground, and that wasn't something that would trigger me to head out for use of force, but since she wasn't sure, then I had to make a call and find out.
So per the policy, if it was just a takedown, that would not necessarily be reportable to a supervisor. Is that right?
Correct.
Had you ever received a call like this from a dispatcher before?
Not in those exact terms, but a few other times dispatchers have called me if they saw something that concerned them.
Okay. And so based on that call, did you decide to make some further inquiry?
I did.
What did you do?
I called Officer Chauvin on his cell phone.
And at this time, I'd asked to publish Exhibit 75.
Hello, if they're here. Yeah, I was just gonna call you and have you come out to our scene here. Not really, but we just had to hold the guy down. He was going crazy, wouldn't go in, coming off his moment, wouldn't go in the back of the squad.
All right. Yes, you are.
All right, thank you.
Now, sir, do you recognize the voice in that call?
Yes,
And whose voice was that?
Officer Chauvin.
That was the conversation, or at least his end of the conversation, as you recall it on that day that you just described.
Yes.
He made a reference to shutting off. Can you explain to the jury what that was in reference to?
I probably asked him if he had his camera on or off, since we're having a private conversation.
And that would be within policy, within the body-worn camera policy for him to shut off during that conversation, is that right?
Yes.
All right. Can you describe then, as best you can recall, the conversation that you had with the defendant after the audio cut?
Can you ask the question again?
Yes, Your Honor. Can you please describe the conversation you had with the defendant? What statements did the defendant make to you during the rest of that call?
I believe he told me that they had tried to put Mr. Floyd, I didn't know his name at the time, but Mr. Floyd in the car. He'd become combative. I think he mentioned that he'd injured, it was either his nose or his mouth, a bloody lip, I think. And eventually, after struggling with him, he'd suffered a medical emergency and an ambulance was called. And then I decided I'd head down to the scene.
Is that the extent of which you can remember the defendant telling you about this incident?
I think that was basically it.
Did he tell you whether he personally applied any particular type of force or restraint to Mr. Floyd?
I don't believe so.
Did he tell you whether or not he had to, or other officers, pin Mr. Floyd to the ground?
I think in the conversation there, he said something about held somebody down.
Did he mention anything about putting his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck or back?
No.
And is the placement of a knee on a subject's neck a use of force?
Yes.
And a reportable type of force?
Not necessarily.
And why is that?
For handcuffing somebody in a prone position or fighting with someone, it could happen where your knee ends up on their neck.
For about how long?
I guess whatever's reasonable.
And which would be when?
Until you get control of the party, I guess.
Control is in the person is then handcuffed.
Handcuffed and not continuing to fight with you anymore.
So once the subject is handcuffed and no longer resisting,
Yes.
at that point, the restraint should stop.
Yeah.
All right, after you spoke with the defendant, what did you do?
I headed down to the 38th in Chicago where he was at.
This time asked to publish Exhibit 1. 38th in Chicago is within the 3rd precinct, is that correct?
Yes.
And you recognize Exhibit 1.
I do.
And you see the area of Cup Foods, the Dragon Walk, and the Speedway. Is that right?
Correct.
Can you please describe what you saw when you arrived at the scene?
I think I pulled up and the officers were standing near their squad car and there might have been an EMS vehicle still on scene and a few people milling around.
Did you recognize the officers?
I did.
Did you speak to anybody prior to your arrival?
I think Officer Chauvin called me just as I was arriving, but it only lasted a second because I was like a half a block out. It said I'll be right there.
At this time, I'd ask to publish Exhibit 267. Here I'm showing you a photo taken from your own body-worn camera, and can you see the timestamp there?
20:45 and 26 seconds.
All right. And you can see the name. Is this your cell phone?
Yes.
And you see that you're receiving a call from the defendant. Is that right?
Yeah, it looks like maybe I'm about to hang up.
Okay. Yes, can you please just describe this conversation as best you can recall?
I think he just called and said, asked where I was at maybe, how long I was out, and I was real close. I said I'll be right there. We'll talk in person. Hung up.
Okay. And you could see from if you could put 267 up again, please. You recognize the building that you were near, right?
Not offhand.
All right. If you could pull up Exhibit 1. All right. If you take a look, can you recall exactly where you were when you pulled up as you were receiving that call?
Where I ended up parking.
Yes.
I think I parked over near the Dragon Walk, kind of in that corner there.
All right. And if you could pull up Exhibit 267 again. Does that building appear to be the Dragon Walk?
Yes.
And obviously, since we have this photo, your body-worn camera was activated, is that right?
Yes.
Do you recall at what point you activated your body-worn camera?
Probably about 2 blocks out.
At the time, were you thinking that you were going to need to do a force review?
Yes.
Based on the description that the defendant gave you, you've already indicated you didn't know there was pressure applied to the neck, is that right?
Right.
Did you get any sense from the defendant how long this restraint lasted?
No, I didn't have any idea.
When you arrived at the scene based on your rank and being a supervisor, did you become the senior officer in charge of the scene?
Yes,
Did you see the officers that you previously mentioned, the defendant, Thomas Lane, Tutau, and Alexander King present?
I did.
Did you have some conversation with those officers about the incident?
Yes,
Were the four of the officers in a group at the time you had this conversation?
yes,
The people who were talking were Thomas Lane and Alexander King, is that right?
yes,
The defendant was nearby and in a position to hear.
yes,
And at that time, you received a summary of what happened from Officer Lane and Officer King, is that right?
yes,
Both of them gave you a statement kind of joining each other.
right.
You know, without talking about what specifically that statement was, after you heard their rendition of the events, did you take that information and use it to determine the next steps that you would take?
Yes, I did.
And based on that conversation, then, were you told that there had been a restraint of an individual?
Yes, I believe that they said they'd handcuffed him.
Okay. And did you learn that an ambulance had been summoned?
I did.
And did you learn that the person that had been restrained was taken away in the ambulance?
Yes,
And where was that person to have been taken?
Hennepin County Medical Center.
Based on that conversation, what did you decide to do?
I decided to drive down to Hennepin County Medical Center myself to check on the party's condition.
Before going to the Hennepin County Medical Center, did you give any direction to the officers that you'd spoken with?
I did. I believe I asked them to hang on to the suspect's vehicle and gather any witnesses that may be around.
And who did you direct to do that?
I believe Officer Lane and King.
Did you give any direction to Officer Tutau or the defendant?
I did. I asked them to head down to Hennepin County Medical Center also.
And then you proceeded to leave the scene to go to the Hennepin County Medical Center.
Yes,
Before you actually left the scene, did you have a further conversation or direction to the defendant?
I don't think so.
Do you recall speaking with the defendant about the need to potentially interview witnesses?
Yes, I did. I asked him to look for some witnesses.
And that was captured on the body-worn camera, is that right?
It should have been, yes.
You've had an opportunity to review that footage?
Yes,
At this time, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 266, and I'm also going to ask to publish 265. They're two different renditions of the same conversation. In Exhibit 266, you will see sort of the body position of the defendant as you're having this conversation, and in the next exhibit, you'll hear the audio. Yes, sir.
While they're taking this quick break, let's just check in with our team. Jennifer Rogers, what do you think the attorneys are getting at here from this testimony?
Well, we're finally starting to see some information about Derek Chauvin's training. You know, what is objectively reasonable? What should an situation? So we have his supervisor talking about how you shouldn't restrain someone after they're not moving, after they're not resisting, and if they're handcuffed. You know, you have him talking about what actually happened. We're hearing the conversation between Chauvin, the supervisor, after all of this happened. So that's all very interesting to set the stage of what happened and to start to set this argument about excessive force that the prosecution is trying to prove.
All right, great, thanks. Let's check back in with the trial.
Did you recognize your own voice in that clip, or was that kind of hard to hear?
it was hard to hear, but it sounded like me.
Okay. And you saw that Officer Chauvin, the defendant, was sort of leaned up against your squad car, is that right?
Yes.
And then if this, we can publish a 265.
You can try, they're pretty, they're all pretty hostile. Okay.
Take that down. So you heard yourself directing the defendant to find witnesses and find their names, is that right?
Yes.
And the defendant told you that he could try, but that they were pretty hostile,
Yes.
but you asked him to do it anyway?
Yes.
And then when you drove away, where did you go?
Hennepin County Medical Center.
Do you know approximately how long it took you to arrive?
I'd guess under 10 minutes.
What did you do once you reached the Hennepin County Medical Center?
I went into the stabilization room,
What's the stabilization room?
a room where they take patients who are critical and work on them there.
What did you see when you arrived at the stabilization room?
They were working on George Floyd. I think they had the Lucas machine going, which does automated chest compressions.
Who was working on them?
Hennepin County Medical Center staff, doctors, nurses.
How long do you think you watched the staff work on Mr. Floyd?
A few minutes maybe.
Did you see or speak with any of the staff members who were working on Mr. Floyd?
I spoke with the nurse while I was there.
Did you ask the nurse for any information?
I was trying to get a condition update.
And did you?
I did.
What did the nurse tell you?
That he was doing bad or poorly.
Now, are you aware of whether, per your direction, the defendant and Officer Tao eventually arrived at the Hennepin County Medical Center?
Yes.
Did you see it in the stabilization room? Or near the stabilization room?
I think outside the stabilization room.
Exhibit 77 is a body-worn camera photo of the defendant. At this time, the state offers Exhibit 77.
And 77 is received.
Publish Exhibit 77. Right. And you see the defendant present here, is that right?
Yes.
And also noting the time on the body-worn camera, 21:05 and 7 seconds, is that right?
Yes.
So about 9:05.
Right.
And you also see Officer Tao.
Yes.
After the nurse told you that Mr. Floyd was doing poorly, what did you do?
I believe I maybe had a conversation with Lieutenant Matson, who was Car 9 that night.
What is Lieutenant Matson's role?
As Car 9, he's kind of in charge of the city in the evening.
And what was the nature of your conversation with the lieutenant?
I think I just let him know that Floyd was doing poorly, and I think he was on the phone with Internal Affairs at that time, giving an update on what was going on.
Did in Exhibit 78 is another image from the body-worn camera depicting Lieutenant Matson. Offer Exhibit 78.
78 is received.
Publish Exhibit 78. Right. What do you see in this photo?
Myself, some of the hospital staff.
And it was after you made these observations that you spoke with Lieutenant Matson?
Yes.
Okay. Did you attempt then, after your conversation with Lieutenant Matson, to gather more information from the defendant and Officer Tao?
I did. I think he requested me to ask them if they'd used any other force.
And did you have that conversation with the defendant?
I did.
Do you recall what the defendant told you?
I believe he said he knelt on Floyd or knelt on his neck, something of that nature. I don't recall his exact words.
And is that the first time you became aware that force had been applied to Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Did the defendant tell you how long he had applied pressure to or restrained Mr. Floyd and applied pressure to his neck?
No.
At some point, did you receive yet another update on Mr. Floyd's medical condition?
I did, someone approached me and let me know that he passed away.
And after you learned that Mr. Floyd passed away, did that change the nature of the incident you were responding to?
Yes, it was deemed a critical incident then.
What is a critical incident?
Something like that where somebody passes away in police custody, a high level, call like a shooting, or where somebody shot and killed by police, things of that nature.
And what are your responsibilities then as the shift sergeant when a critical incident happens in an area over which you have supervisory authority?
It needs to be roped off with police tape and evidence preserved. Body worn cameras, make sure they're turned back on.
What has to be done with the people who were involved in the critical incident?
They need to be kept separate and eventually transported down to the courthouse.
And in this case, did you take specific steps that were consistent with critical incident response?
I did.
What did you do?
I got a hold of Sergeant John Edwards, who was the overnight supervisor who had just come on, and asked him to head down to 30th in Chicago and secure that scene. And then I believe I got a hold of some other sergeants to help set up rides for the involved officers down to City Hall.
So in who's contacting Sergeant Edwards, you're essentially handing off the actual physical scene to the next supervisory sergeant for the 3rd Precinct, is that right?
Yes.
And you were able to secure transport officers or rides for officers Lane and King?
I don't recollect if there was need to found the rides for those two or Tom and Chauvin. But I found somebody to figure it out.
Can you describe your interactions with the defendant after you discovered that Mr. Floyd had passed away?
Other than asking him to get down to 108. Not too.
What's 108?
Room 108 is one of the rooms in the City Hall where the officers are going to gather to be interviewed and stuff after the critical incident.
What did you then proceed to room 108?
I did.
And what did you do after you proceeded to room 108?
I mostly just waited till the officers were interviewed and eventually headed back to the 3rd Precinct station.
Did you have any further interaction with the defendant at room 108, or did the other administrative personnel take charge?
Pretty much the other administrative personnel.
After then directing Edwards to secure the scene, making sure that the officers reported as they were supposed to, did you at some point gather some additional evidence associated with this case?
I did.
When was that?
I was back at the 3rd Precinct, and I believe Officer Lane approached me and had forgotten some information in his pocket, some witness information that he'd taken from somebody in the vehicle, and turned that over to me, which I turned over to another officer to be property inventoried.
And after inventorying that information or that material, did you have any other involvement in the case?
I wrote a short report on turning that information over, and that was it for the night.
Okay. And when did your shift end that night?
I don't recall what time I left the station that night.
Now again, you have reviewed the body-worn camera footage associated with this case, is that right?
I have.
And as the supervisory shift sergeant, you're a person who typically does force reviews, is that right?
Yes.
And to clarify your testimony from earlier, the restraint of an individual on the ground is a form of force, correct?
Yes.
And restraining someone on the ground handcuffed, that's considered to be the prone position, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that a person may be restrained only to the degree necessary to keep them under control
Yes,
and no more restraint.
right.
Based upon your review of this incident, do you believe that the restraint should have ended at some point in the encounter?
Grounds?
All right, they're having a little break right now to review some information.